Terry Keeley just asked me, are these all your students? And of course they're not. I'm delighted that so many of you could come and so many of my faculty colleagues could make it a part of their course. I've had a long career based on the principle that you could be a religious person and still be very successful in business. And once in a while, I feel obliged to bring somebody forward who exemplifies, who role models this vision. And Terry Keeley is certainly that sort of person. Very brief introduction. Terry went here to Notre Dame, got his undergraduate degree. Then he went to the White House and wrote speeches for Ronald Reagan. And I'm sure some of you will be excited about that and some a little disappointed, but that's okay. Then he went to Oxford, studied economics. And then he went to work for the famous Swiss bank UBS, where he was for 23 years. Left as an officer, and now he's doing his own private company involved with sovereign wealth. He's learned the great lesson at Notre Dame. He gives back. He's a benefactor. And that's not the only reason he's here, but he is endowed a lecture series where we bring back somebody from the Vatican each year and to speak about the Catholic Church, and they brought an archbishop back, different one from the Vatican each year, and that's one of Terry's legacies, I think. He wrote an article for the Notre Dame magazine a year and a half ago, which some of you may have read, and if you haven't, you ought to take a look at it. I'm just going to quote one sentence from the article. Terry says, "As a man of conscience, I have been greatly pained by the economic and financial headlines of the past 18 months. I have wondered whether my life has been inadvertently given over to ignoble pursuits, if not outright evil." And with that introduction, it's my pleasure to present Terry Keeley.
Thank you, Ali. I Ali, owe you a particular debt of gratitude. For me, ladies and gentlemen, coming back to Notre Dame is really coming home. And my heart pumps a little bit faster. And I'm always, I don't know, for some reason more complete when I come back to campus. And so I'm very grateful, Ali, for the invitation to return. Obviously, one of the reasons I'm so happy to be here is because I legitimately believe that some of the best students in the world have the privilege of learning here. And of course, as we all know, to whom much is given, much is expected. I'm also particularly grateful we didn't do this last night, because I think Pitt would have been a bit of a challenge for this room. I know that's what I was doing. Ali's asked me to speak about how Caritas informs business. And in fact, I'm going to speak much more personally tonight. I'm going to speak how Caritas informs me and how, through me, I've attempted to, I hope, promote things in the business world that are consistent with that teaching. Caritas, like most papal encyclicals, is a very easy read, but it turns out it's quite hard to live by. I think all of us think of charity as something that we're supposed to do tithing or donate to our favorite alma mater or spend a couple hours each week in community service. But that's not the lesson of Caritas, not at all. It turns out that it's a far more demanding request. In fact, it's an entire way of being. The role of charity, we learn in Caritas, is in fact that we be endlessly self-giving, that we be forever other-regarding. And it's not just about being nice to our families or those around the corner. It's about our entire community. It's about cross-border, cross-generation, and intergenerational requirements, what we owe to the next generation. So tonight I need to reflect on all the radical implications of that. Turns out to live Caritas means our work is never going to be done. But here's the joke. Not to live Caritas is even worse. A life that is not other-centered, in fact, will not fulfill you. A life that is not built on the kinds of all-encompassing charity that the Holy Father calls us to is not going to bring you much meaning and much joy. I wrote here, integral human development and completeness are rare achievements of overachievers. And I know lots of them. A lot of people that are worth billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and not very happy. Caritas was delivered at St. Peter's on the 29th of June, 2009. And as you all know, it was very much influenced by the crisis, the Great Recession, which obviously has its origins in decades of over-leverage and mismanagement. The Holy Father states, as almost every encyclical does, that he does not have any technical solutions to offer, but that, and I quote, the Church searches for truth, proclaims it tirelessly, and recognizes it wherever it is manifested. This demanding truth, my words, now require that we acknowledge this horrendous failure that we've been through. And we all have to have a great deal of energy trying to make the world a better place. Now, I've always been somebody that thought, my duty is to make the world a better place. But those of us who take Caritas literally realize that it's been raised to a different level. It becomes a sacred duty. So as you write, Ali, about 1 week before Caritas was published, I had The Eye of the Needle come out in obviously one of the world's leading journals of economic thought, Notre Dame magazine. In this article, I asked talk about what is the causes of the Great Recession, but more importantly, I asked about what's my personal role. What did I do something wrong? Have I contributed somehow to this crisis? And if so, what am I supposed to do about it? And it turns out I did find out things that I've done wrong. I appreciate it, Ali. I hope everybody gets a chance to read it. In my opinion, a great deal of the reason why we are now forced into a very painful area of thrift, changing both our personal and our national priorities, is because for years, we as individuals and as a society, as a country, lived way beyond our means, lives of excess. In particular, we've gotten used to the idea that it's okay to have a big mortgage, big student loans, big credit card bills, auto debts, on top of our federal, state, and local governments borrowing lots of money. This is actually a choice. It's certainly not a God-given right, and it turns out it was a very bad choice. Easy to illustrate. Take two lists of countries. Take those countries which from 1995 to 2005 had savings rates of greater than 10%, and another list of all those countries since 2007 that have had outperformance in terms of economic growth, very highly correlated. Countries who have saved for a rainy day, well, they've survived this storm pretty well. We Americans, we're levered, and we're getting shellacked. So self-evidently, as a country, we must learn to save and invest more and consume less cravenly. If we don't, we've got more troubles ahead. Now, over-leverage has not been my personal failing. I don't have debts or mortgages. I'm pretty lucky in that regard. But I am guilty of two other grave sins. And those sins are the sins of pride and hubris. And here's the problem. These sins on Wall Street are widely pervasive. In fact, I think it's a disease that's airborne. I never questioned my good fortune from 2000 to 2005, when my income rather miraculously quintupled, even though I think I was working less hard. I got to fly first class everywhere. Somehow, I just was worth 5 times more to society. And I never really reflected. Has my level of social contribution changed? Is there anything that I've done to earn all this? I never reflected. It was great. It was great. This was wrong. And in penance, ladies and gentlemen, I am working quite hard, campaigning quite hard, both personally and institutionally, for changes. For one, I've worked very hard to change the notion of Wall Street pay. It was wrongly constructed, and it still is. We cannot have a system which privatizes profits and socializes losses. On that one, Barney Frank is absolutely correct. When it comes to systematically important institutions like banks, the incentive structure of workers has to be aligned with that of shareholders and society at large. We have more work to do in that. When private markets do not act in society's interest, the government has to intervene. That's government's role, and it's also very consistent with long-standing teachings in papal encyclicals, remediating the excesses of unbridled capitalism. The thing is, the art of governing actually lies in maximizing these desired social outcomes while minimizing their unintended consequences. And on this balance, I'm sorry, we all have to be much more humble than we tend to be. The famous proverb, it's glib, but it's true. All too often, the road to hell has been paved with good intentions. We have it self-evidently in our federal housing policies. We channeled lots of money, partly under the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, to subprime borrowers. Turns out it's not a good idea to lend lots of money to people who don't pay it back. There's many of other examples. I think Bill Evans, when he spoke at the forum on the common good, which I participated, talked about how forcing developing countries to have the same labor standards as developed countries, not a good policy, well-intended, not good. In the course of history, the Pope has written in Caritas, it was often maintained that the creation of institutions was sufficient to guarantee the fulfillment of humanity's right to development. Unfortunately, too much confidence was placed in those institutions. In reality, I go on to quote, institutions by themselves are not enough because integral human development is primarily a vocation and therefore requires a free assumption of responsibility. These are incredibly profound words, dear friends. Like 6 of his predecessors, Leo XIII, Pius XI and XII, John the 23rd, Paul VI, and John Paul II, Benedict here is talking about the concept of subsidiarity. Those who want to ascribe an activist role to government need to understand deeply where subsidiarity, and I think everyone knows the issue of subsidiarity. That's the principle that authorities should only act on those matters where individuals or lesser officials cannot perform on their own. Subsidiarity basically requires that we delineate very carefully what in fact is a responsibility of government, of individual, and God. As Catholics, we call regularly upon the Litany of Saints, our higher angels, for guidance, but we also pray for gracious intervention. I quote Benedict again. Modern man is wrongly convinced he is the sole author of himself, his life, and society. This is a presumption that follows from being selfishly closed in on himself and is a consequence, expressed in faith terms, of original sin. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I see the historic indifference that I maintained about my excessive pay levels relative to others who perform much more meritorious work as a lapse of consciousness. I think it is in contravention to the ideals that Caritas espouses. I'm human, I'm fallen, I need redemption, I pray every day that I be better. Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. The miracle of it all is somehow, time and again, no matter what I do, somehow I still remain worthy of God's love, and that's the miracle. This said, I have no shame in admitting to any of you that in response to my irredeemable shortcomings, I am not going to vacate the financial services business. How many finance majors in the room? Please raise your hand. Okay, listen up. I'm not leaving finance. And I'm also not seeking to earn less money, not necessarily. For all my faults, I recognize that my God-given vocation, what I am called to do, is not, unfortunately, work like Michelle Rhee to redesign what's going on in education in the United States, or anybody else involved in very meritorious work. I admire them so much. My vocation is elsewhere. The proper work of finance is absolutely essential to the future of human development, and I happen to know a great deal about it. In fact, in some areas, the investment of public assets, I'm one of the global authorities. A fair wage does not mean no wage, or even a low wage. Sometimes one's social contribution can be measured in 6, 7, 8 figures or even more. I suspect many of you have seen the movie The Social Network. Part of the genius and justice of the free market system is that it does not stifle or contradict incentives for transformational innovation. In fact, it fosters it. A great deal of human progress has depended and will continue to depend on just this kind of innovation, and our regulatory and tax laws must encourage it. The Holy Father himself writes in Caritas, quote, "Finance, through the renewed structures and operating methods that have to be designed after its misuse, which wreaks such havoc on the real economy, now needs to go back to being an instrument towards improved wealth creation and development." This is my role as a devout Catholic. Our role, if you are in finance, is to further urge the financial services profession in this direction, to improve wealth creation and development. Trillions of dollars change hands every day across the global capital markets. Judgments about how that capital is supposed to be allocated will have extraordinary human implications. Society will suffer, and those at the lowest end of the ladder will suffer the most if that capital is inefficiently deployed. I reject the idea that capital investment should be left to the sole discretion of people who have no civic consciousness. So what am I doing? What are some of the things that I'm involved in now? Well, today, my advisory assignments involve the design of workable capital controls for two specific, but several other emerging market economies. Many of you know many emerging market countries are struggling to maintain the balance between economic growth and these inflationary pressures. Inflationary pressures, which, by the way, hit the poorest hardest because they spend the greatest percentage of their income on foodstuff. I'm also establishing proper rules and procedures for the investment of public assets and infrastructure, private equity, and alternative asset classes for the United Nations. I'm helping to refine central bank mandates, including their specific regulatory remits. I'm instilling best practices in dynamic asset allocation for sovereign wealth managers, which certainly need to optimize the return on these public assets. I think these are relatively laudable pursuits. I hope my maker will agree. I'll check in with him later. Incontestably, they are my passions. I would really like to talk more about how your passions could be realized in these fields. I think there are many promising areas. We were talking at lunch, Ali, microfinance. Microfinance, absolutely critical. The Holy Father talks about microfinance in Caritas as well. Infrastructure finance, many, many areas where men and women of conscience can contribute. What you should note now, though, and what you will note in all of my responses, is a commitment to free markets. An unflagging commitment to making capitalism work, even though it clearly veers towards excess. Benedict agrees with this, and so did John Paul II before him. In Centesimus Annus, John Paul II writes, "On the level of individual nations and of international relations, the free market is the most efficient instrument for utilizing resources and effectively responding to human needs." In the second chapter of Caritas, entitled Human Development in Our Time, the Holy Father engages, just like Paul VI and John Paul II in Populorum Progressio and Centesimus, in a very broad survey of human condition in our time, checking in, taking a broad survey, how's the earth doing? He finds a lot of things are unacceptable, a lot of achievements lacking. Among these are the scandal of glaring inequalities, labor market insecurity, rife corruption and illegal practice, the increased commercialization of culture, endemic food shortages, insufficient guarantees of water and food for the world's most vulnerable, and of course, naked indifference to the rights of the unborn. Now, he said earlier that the Church does not have any technical solutions to offer, states that right up. But the Holy Father does not shy away from criticizing a whole bunch of technical solutions that haven't been working. For example, he says there is excessive zeal for protecting intellectual property rights. He's very critical of some of the budget cuts that were ordered by the IMF in some emerging market countries in the last bailouts because they did undue harm to social safety nets. He's not big on the high tariffs that rich nations put on poor nations' goods. And trade union rights, Benedict writes, I quote, "must be honored today even more than in the past as a prompt and far-sighted response to the urgent need for new forms of cooperation at the international level." So here we have food insecurity, the Holy Father states, needs to be addressed within a long-term perspective, eliminating the structural causes that give rise to it. This can be done by investing in rural infrastructure, irrigation systems, transport, and he goes on. Some cynics would say so much for not offering technical solutions. In another passage, the Holy Father states the following: the dignity of the individual and the demands of justice require, particularly today, that economic choices do not cause disparities in wealth to increase in an excessive and morally unacceptable manner. Well, okay. That's tautological. It's of course true. Nothing should increase in a morally unacceptable. Shifting money from the rich to the poor should not be done in an excessive and morally unacceptable manner. Regarding exactly what is excessive, not a lot of clarity. We're left to figure that out for ourselves. So I think, Ali, that's a good senior thesis topic. Should be assigned. When I was an undergraduate here, studying with my dear friend Steve Reifenberg, who's in the front row, God bless him, doing a great job running the Kellogg program here, I was a big proponent, I think you were too, Steve, of John Rawls' theory of justice. I thought it was the bee's knees. In the summer between my junior and senior years, I was working in Detroit, simultaneously working for a welfare rights organization, helping welfare mothers, most of them illiterate, figure out what amount of food stamps they were entitled to, and simultaneously writing drafts for the Republican National Convention Platform Committee, which went on to elect Ronald Reagan, and there I ended up in the White House. The other night at dinner, my eldest son, Julian, 15, who wants to go to Duke, announced that he doesn't think it's possible, Ali, to actually be a Republican and go to heaven. It just incompatible. He said, listen, higher income should obviously pay more taxes, but Republicans won't let them. Guns should obviously be banned. He has no self-doubt. He takes after his mother. Republicans won't let guns be banned. And obviously, George Bush started this unnecessary war. Thousands of innocent people were killed. Basically, my son thinks Republicans are a bunch of bad dudes. When I read Caritas, especially in certain parts, I can see why a lot of people would agree with my son Julian. There's a whole list of quotes here, and I'm not going to go over all of them in the interest of time, but just a couple are instructive. Quote, what is needed is a worldwide redistribution of energy resources so countries lacking those resources can have access to them. So let's take energy from those who have it and give it to those who don't, okay? What is needed, quote, alongside profit-oriented private enterprise are various types of public enterprises and rooms for commercial entities based on mutualist principles. It is from their reciprocal encounter in the marketplace that one may expect hybrid forms of commercial behavior to emerge. Hence, attentiveness to ways to civilize the economy. So we're supposed to civilize the economy. Elsewhere, in the global area, economic activity cannot prescind from gratuitousness. Economic activity must be marked by, quote, quotas of gratuitousness and communion. Quote, business management cannot concern itself only with the interest of the proprietors, but must also assume responsibility for all the other stakeholders who contribute to the life of the business, the workers, the clients, the suppliers of various elements of production, the community of reference. What all these statements to me say, or proclamations really, not statements, they all entail proposals to temper or ameliorate unbridled capitalism. Civilize the economy, economic laws which are redolent of the spirit of gift, quotas of gratuitousness and communion. Many analysts, and I would include myself amongst them, feel that there's an inevitable trade-off between economic efficiency and the promotion of equality. But I think liberals and conservatives alike can and must unite on the hopes and aspirations which underpin all of these exhortations of the Holy Father. If capitalism does not lead to greater protection of the defenseless, if capitalism is not promoting greater human dignity, expanding opportunities for those who are seeking them, then what's its purpose? What's it all about? Quoting Benedict again, make a commitment to securing integral human development inspired by values of charity and truth. We must all do this. Capitalism left strictly to itself, clearly, and we talked about this at lunch, it would not result in the fulfillment of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. Wouldn't happen. I believe that the United Nations Millennium Development Goals need to be striven for. We certainly would not want to live in any kind of world where they are not. The Church's social teaching consists of a centuries-long narrative, constantly and consistently illuminated by the teachings of Jesus, yet made pertinent to the circumstances of the day. This is worthy of a little sidebar. Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum of New Things addressed the systematic exploitation of labor by capital, which was prevalent in the 19th century. And it underscored the free rights of workers to assemble into unions. There's a long history of the church defending unions. 40 and 100 years on, specifically, Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno and Paul II in Centissimus, they continued this meditation on the shortcomings and imperfections of the social order. They each shed light on the prevailing dark challenges of their day. So in 1931, Pius XI observed how collectivist economies appeared as dismissive and destructive of basic human value, like human dignity, as unbridled capitalism did. Paul XI had no more time for professed socialists, who actually had thinly veiled communist leanings, predominant in Europe in his time, than Leo XIII had for Jay Gould. And we all remember how wonderful Jay Gould was in the 19th century, right? He cornered the gold market on 3 separate occasions. He bribed officials to get certain contracts, ended up acquiring 10,000 miles of railway, all with government loans, and then he sold them all off and pocketed the equity. Seems like we don't get around this privatizing profits while socializing risks. In Caritas, in addition to highlighting specific problems like inadequate access to food and water, as I mentioned, the Holy Father also draws our attention to several general failings in our age. I want to dwell on just 2 of these and then open up for questions. The 2 general criticisms that the Pope offers are, 1, the loss of trust in our systems of governance, in the market system, and the abrogation of international justice. Both of these criticisms have moved me greatly, and in an attempt to live Caritas, I've been drawn into action. In the section of Caritas entitled Fraternity, Economic Development, and Civil Society, Benedict writes the following: without forms of solidarity and mutual trust, the market cannot completely fulfill its proper economic function. Today, it is this trust which has ceased to exist. This loss of trust is a grave loss. Clearly, an urgent calling for Catholics, and all men and women of goodwill, of course, is to do whatever we can to restore trust to our markets and to our institutions of governance. Without greater solidarity and trust, it's quite easy to imagine anarchy around the corner. I'm rising to this challenge on 2 fronts, one personal, the other institutional. On the personal front, I united with a group of like-minded professionals, not all Catholics, I have to say, but we're across all time zones, to promote a new and entirely voluntary code of ethics for the financial services industry. The code has been encapsulated in something we call the Financial Hippocratic Oath. Some of you have picked up one of our cards as you came in. Each one of us are devoting time and resources to promote the FHO in our various professional societies. I speak around Wall Street and a number of ethical study groups, and through multiple media outlets. I would not say that lions are laying down with the lambs just yet, Ali, but we've been gaining some ground. Thousands of financial professionals, I think, are reflecting on their work today in ways that they might not otherwise. Financiers are no different than firemen, soldiers, teachers, doctors, and professional athletes. We all must be reminded of the opportunities we have to ennoble our profession and improve our society, as well as discredit it. We wrote on our website, which is www.financialhippocraticoath.org, please visit it, quote, to succeed in the broadest sense, we must embrace our collective responsibility to serve the greater good by maintaining unimpeachable ethics. There's a lot of ethical movements like this one. I tend to support many of them. Ethical movements like the FHO and the MBA Oath movement, which was started by a group of students at Harvard, are things I think Notre Dame students perhaps could and should become more involved with. Some of you may know that I wrote an op-ed for The Observer on this topic on November the 8th. For certain reasons I disagree with, Mendoza has been very reluctant to embrace the oath-taking movement, not just the Financial Hippocratic Oath, but all oath-takings. And I'm not very convinced by the reasons that have been given. Here's what I wrote in my Observer op-ed. Notre Dame is now at a crossroads. Do her students, faculty members, and alumni work together to promote broad ethical movements in science, business, architecture, teaching, finance, all professions, in fact, or do they let certain university officials with uncontestable principles speak on their behalf? Will Our Lady's university leaders and students actively engage other students and other schools and like-minded reformers in the pursuit of universal behavioral codes, or will they restrain Notre Dame from engaging in these activities? Will Notre Dame lead or lag in the growing number of well-intended oath-taking movements? If the latter, in this era of profound doubt, what exactly is Notre Dame going to do to restore faith and trust in our markets, our government, our scientific endeavors, our professions? Will these efforts prove sufficient? Can Notre Dame do more? I think, ladies and gentlemen, it is virtually impossible not to hear Caritas in these questions, and that is their source. I'm going to ask you all tonight, what are you going to do? Part of the solution, part of the problem. Regarding this issue of trust, I have also been laboring on another front. In addition to promoting personal responsibility, I've engaged on the institutional front, along with a number of elected officials, including my friend Congressman Mike Pence of Indiana from the neighboring district. I've been speaking and publishing about several specific areas of governance. One in particular questions the role we've assigned to our central bank, the Federal Reserve. Again, the article was here when you came in. Some of you may have gotten a copy of it. This was an op-ed I published with Bloomberg and Business Week last week, where I'm a contributing editor. The title of the article, which I didn't like, they assigned it, Fed Tune-Up Would Silence Calls to Trash It. Quote, perhaps the gravest of a long list of casualties of the Great Recession is the loss of public trust in government institutions. Recent polls show that only 1 in 7 Americans believe U.S. authorities will do the right thing most of the time. This is a record low. Renewed longing for rules-based governance, policies like mandated budget balance amendments, the gold standard. These are corollaries of the trust implosion. Given how activist government policies have resulted in catastrophe, it's clear federal agencies require a tighter leash. As it has proven impossible for the Fed to promote full employment, maintain financial market sanctity, and ensure price stability for the sake of its independence, our economy, and for the restoration of public trust, it is time for the Fed's operating instructions to be overhauled. The Fed must not be set up to fail. It must be retooled for success. Here again, Caritas is unmistakable. Trust has been lost. Part of that implosion is because governments failed to do what they pledged to do. Trust must be restored. It cannot be if certain our government institutions are being set up under false premises, claiming they'll do things they can't. Employment in the United States, first and foremost, is a function of our tax, trade, education, and regulatory policies. Central banks only control the money supply and inflation. At the end of the day, they control none of the key variables with regard to our competitiveness and employment. Is subsidiarity being observed in the dual mandate? No, clearly it is not. Is there a better mandate for the Fed? Yes, there is. In Caritas, and all these will be my closing remarks so we can get to Q&A. In Caritas, the Holy Father also talks about intergenerational justice. A lot of the focus on intergenerational justice in Caritas relates to the exploitation of our non-renewable resources in the environment. But I think nowhere is the issue of intergenerational justice more compelling and disconcerting in the United States anyway, than in the trillions of dollars of debt that we're leaving to our next generation. Every infant born in the United States today wakes up with $65,000 in direct and indirect federal obligations already assigned to their head. That's a very expensive first breath. I spent a lot of time working on this issue. I used to work for David Stockman. Phil Graham is a friend of mine. I've looked at every single budget plan out there. I testified to Simpson Bowles. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1 hour, a little bit more, my friend, close friend, Congressman Paul Ryan, is giving the response to the State of the Union address. He was chosen by the Republican leadership primarily because of this. This is a roadmap for America's future version 2.0. I'm going to bring Paul Ryan to campus. We're going to talk about this. A roadmap to solve America's long-term economic and fiscal crisis. I won't go into the details, but I'd invite you all tonight to spend some time listening to the President of the United States, who I think did a fantastic job with Tucson, and then Paul Ryan, and decide for yourselves which side of this debate will you each come down on this critical issue of intergenerational justice, particularly as it involves our fiscal situation. Let's stop there. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Well, Terry doesn't pull any punches. He didn't when he was a student here, and he certainly didn't tonight. It was a wonderful, provocative discussion. And now let's not pull any punches with Terry. Let's have some good questions. There are people with microphones, I think, around.
And I completely respect if anybody in the room has something else more important to do, so please don't feel like leaving now is a bad idea. I'd love people who are going to stay really to be involved in the Q&A. So I really don't mind. Nobody can hurt my feelings. You want to go, go. I can't believe it.
There's so many faculty here.
Okay.
I did tell Terry our custom here is we finish at 8 o'clock sharp. So, questions? Please.
This is James Pappas, for those of you who don't know.
Mr. Keeley, you mentioned that as your career was blossoming over the last 10 years, you fell victim sort of to pride and hubris. But what tangibly or specifically would you do if you could go back in time and to effect change and maybe prevent the crisis?
I think that question should be posed simultaneously to me and to Bob Ruman, Vice Chairman of Citibank. Okay? Former Secretary of the Treasury, who was taking home $25 million a year from Citibank, James, while Citibank itself was running risks that literally drove our country into the ditch. I think all of us now know our heads were not on straight. We should have asked very simply the question, we should all ask, the total amount of profits in the S&P 500 generated by financial services firms historically had been around 14%. From 1998 to 2005, it went to 41%. We've stopped making things in this country. We don't make CARs, we make CDOs. We need to make CARs. And I think, for whatever reason, this whole talent pool that went into, financial engineering and all of the derivatives contracts, and you've read all the books that I have. I just think that if you're not connecting your work, James, back to building an enterprise, building a road, building a sewer, what the hell are you doing? And I'm grateful that through that whole time, my primary interests were sovereign wealth. Central banks, I've always been in that space. Making money just to make money? This is one thing I meant to say. A lot of people operate by the learn, earn, and return model. I'm going to get a good degree, I'm going to go make a bunch of money, and then I'm going to give it back to... There's a couple things wrong with the learn, earn, and return model. One thing is sometimes you don't earn. Another thing is sometimes you don't return. You're all going to graduate. You're all going to be looking for jobs to pay back those massive student loans. If you love what you do, truly love what you do, you won't derive all your self-worth from that paycheck. Okay? It's going to be what you did. That'd be my response. Sir.
Hi, Justin Sunshine, undergraduate finance program.
Hi, Justin.
You were talking about compensation policies on Wall Street.
Yeah.
What is your overall plan for changing that? What would you like to see investment banks and commercial banks do to change the incentive program?
Yeah. Well, I think a very good idea just came out of Barclays, Bob Diamond. So one of the things that is needed to stabilize the financial system, the banking system in particular, is they need a lot more capital. And a new innovation has come up called contingent capital, COCOs. And one of the ideas is to pay employees directly with COCOs, contingent capital. Again, this aligns, Justin, the interests of the bank and its shareholders with the employee. Am I going to try and go out and blow up Barclays with a great, if I'm a trader at Barclays, I get to bet the firm's money every day. Okay? I make a lot of money, I'm going to get some of that. I lose a lot of money, bad quarter for Barclays. My friend will always hire me over at Goldman. No, it doesn't work. So by keeping those interests aligned, and COCOs I think is one way to do it, that would be one thing that I would strongly recommend. Deferring more compensation in the form of equity that vests over a longer period of time. Lots of practical things can be done, particularly with institutions of social relevance like banks. Sir, sorry.
How you doing?
RFH, what's that stand for?
Romsey Fairhaven Regional High School.
Ah, okay.
So,
big shout out.
yep. I was reading your article that they distributed in our classes, and you said the first criticism you had of the Federal Reserve was it allowed interest rates to remain too low for too long after 9/11.
The Taylor rule.
I was wondering where you thought, based on the corporate social responsibility movement and all that, where do you feel like it was the responsibility of financial managers to notice the bubble forming and less of the Fed regulating? Because you said yourself, the Fed controls interest rates and money supply. They don't really, as far as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't oversee regulations on financial markets.
They don't. Not in some ways they do. For some banks, but not all banks. Yeah.
Right. So I was wondering, to me it kind of seems like blaming the Fed for allowing the bubble to form is kind of like touching the stove and then yelling at the stove for being hot. So I'm curious where you feel the responsibility of the Fed lies in controlling the financial markets and controlling bubble formations versus where does good, sound, professional financial management techniques and tools come in.
Your name?
Chris.
Chris, that's an excellent question. The question that Chris has raised is actually an unanswered question in academia, and it gets to the argument lean versus clean. Is a central bank's job to lean against asset bubbles while they're forming, not let them get too big, or are they supposed to clean up after they burst, which was basically the premise that Alan Greenspan operated on. A very good article was written by William White of the BIS, called Is Price Stability Enough?, published by the BIS in 2004. It gets to the heart of this question. We have a problem in the United States of America, which is that we have allowed our central bank, or basically put them into a position where they need to force these asset bubbles to keep the economy going. We live from bubble to bubble in this country. We lived off of the NASDAQ bubble. Now we lived off the housing bubble. The problem is sometimes they blow up. You get something worse. Without question, it is the central bank's responsibility to maintain stability in the system. The mandate is very clear. Promote full employment and price stability. That's what the mandate says. There's also a third part of the mandate, financial market sanctity. I was just on Bloomberg TV last week, and I said, this is very clear. These guys are like the Washington Redskins. They're 6-10, last in their division, season after season. Bernanke's like Mike Shanahan, okay? Lots of third and long positions, and he's not converting. We don't have full employment. We certainly do not have financial market stability. I would take them out of that business. You asked me, what are the financial markets operators' responsibilities? I spent part of the afternoon with my dear friend, Scott Malpass. And I'll tell you what his responsibility is. Make Notre Dame's endowment grow. Right? How? Ethically. But if there's a bubble, he should probably be riding that. Is gold in a bubble? Some people think it's going to go to $1,600. Do you participate in that bubble? If you are a fiduciary, you explain to everybody what the risks are, but you're trying to do the best for your client. It is a responsibility, Chris, of regulators to make sure that those blinking yellow lights don't turn into red lights. which is what we've had happen. Does that help?
Thank you.
Okay, a couple more questions. Any faculty members in the audience? Pity that. Yes? Any questions? Come on, I got questions for you. Well, that's a good question. I don't think they'll work in practice. I think that those are probably heavily litigatable.
Can you repeat that question?
Oh, the question was with regard to compensation. Are clawbacks a valid tool that should be considered by regulators? I think it just would be very hard to do. I certainly would require it of any investment that I'm making in terms of high watermarks and other things. Until you get your money back, you don't pay the fees. But I think that is just a regulatory hornet's nest. I would not advocate it. But I certainly think, I don't know a CEO on Wall Street, and I know several of them, that doesn't want pay to come down. They would be delighted to pay people less money. The problem is, if they do, then they just move to another firm. And so I think we're going to have several years of keeping this pressure on. And I think it's critical that people speak up publicly about how unconscionable it is. Does that help? Boards have a clear responsibility, no question. But boards have, again, responsibility to shareholders. James, I didn't mean to sound flip about Bob Rubin, but look, Secretary of the Treasury. And he didn't know what Citibank was doing and had no idea where the risks are? And he's clicking $25 million a year? Larry Summers, who's seen Inside Job? Inside Job. I think it's required. I think everybody should see Inside. I think there is an insidious relationship in the financial services industry between the regulators and the regulatees. Absolutely incestuous. We handled this in 1933 by taking the fox, Joseph Kennedy, and putting him in charge of the hen house. He knew he was breaking all the laws. Let's make him write the laws. That's how we did with the SEC. I didn't think we went far enough this time, candidly. Yeah.
No, speak in the microphone.
Or you can shout it out.
Over here. Johnson Silver. So I had one question for you. You mentioned in your article, as well as you referenced it here, about the trust in the government being very low. Do you have any suggestions on how the government can regain the trust of its population?
I'm a big believer in adult talk. I was so angry today with Bob Herbert's editorial in the New York Times talking about Social Security reform, which is necessary, urgent. I mean, we built this system when people died at 53, and now they die when they're 83. We got to change the system. Bob Herbert talks about the mugging, that whenever there's some talk, it's like mugging a poor person. I think we need to talk very openly and honestly, adult talk, about how serious our problems are. And we need to base the resolution on very clear principles, subsidiarity being one of them. I was outraged. Ali, we talked about this at lunch. There we are, Tucson. Boom, horrible thing. And it's Sarah Palin's fault. First and foremost, Jared Loughner's failures happened at home. If this kid had a Glock at home and he's sleeping in his parents' house, what the hell are the parents doing? Where is responsibility lie? And we have to have that kind of conversation in our country. Who's responsible? How do we take care of the truly needy? How do we defend the defenseless? And how do we make everyone else do what they're capable of? And that's, I think, going to be a very tough discussion, but it's written all over the roadmap. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Kevin. In follow-up on his question, just in regards of our obligation as Notre Dame students, faculty, just to sort of work collaboratively and bringing trust back into governments and societies. What should we be doing now, and just what sort of habits should we be developing so that in the future we're prepared and more suitable to handle those sorts of challenges?
I'm going to tell you, be a domer. On Wall Street, I've had the privilege of working with lots of folks. But whenever I had a colleague from Notre Dame, I knew what we were doing. we were going to do the right thing. That's just what it was. And I think, I don't much like this Mendoza, ask more of business. I don't like that phrase, actually. No, don't ask more. You guys need a job. Okay? I mean, don't ask more business. Be a very valued contributor to a firm that you have fully vetted, that you believe in. Do work that you fundamentally believe in. Do it better than anybody else. Volunteer time. Okay? Never lose sight of the fact that you are amongst the most privileged people on the face of the earth. Look at the privilege. What are you going to do with that?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nick.
Hi, Nick.
And you spoke a lot about what the Federal Reserve and a lot of U.S. agencies can do.
Yeah.
But where does the U.S. stand in a global context and working especially with our European partners?
Okay, well, thanks for the question. I have an article coming out in Foreign Affairs magazine entitled Beyond Bretton Woods. And you're absolutely right to ask the question. We got to fix the United States, but there's a whole global system out there. And I happen to believe that the current policing of exchange rates, our trade system, World Trade Organization, IMF in particular, they're not working. These are failed institutions. The G20 event that was just held in Seoul was a disaster. It did absolutely, these are supposed to be pro-growth events. It was exactly the antithesis, okay? What I believe is that free trade and fair trade are not always the same thing. What I also believe, though, fundamentally, is that the free flow of capital and the free flow of ideas is essential if we're going to look. Poverty rates, global poverty rates in the last 20 years have fallen by 50% because of China and India. So we don't have to ask anymore the question, do free markets work? We don't have to doubt that at all. They do. The question is, what are some of the implications? In fact, in Caritas, the Pope talks about how outsourcing is an evil. And this has made some labor markets very uncomfortable. And I'm thinking to myself, we got to do two sides of that. India, China, all of these other countries have benefited from outsourcing. How can we say, Steve, in the aggregate, is outsourcing good or bad? Add it up, the pluses and negatives. I don't know. Is outsourcing bad? I guess it depends. So, free trade. International government agencies that work, World Trade Organization, IMF, redos, do-overs. We need to have, Doha round has been dead for 8 years. Nothing's happening. And we continue to have massive agricultural subsidies in rich countries, which make no sense. Dramatic changes. Dramatic changes. Does that help?
Yeah.
Ali, 8 o'clock. I'm just as keen as you are. One more question? Sir.
My name is Paul. I'm also from RFH. I know where Chris went.
Shout out. Yeah.
Now, I just want to ask you a little bit more of a personal question. What kind of unethical and inhumane things have you seen throughout your career happen?
Well, I'll tell you specifically. In the sovereign space, there's a lot of bribery. So I'll give you a specific example. The portfolio manager of the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, the Central Bank of China, which manages $2.3 trillion, had a salesperson at Bear Stearns pay for the college tuition of their children under the table, and they directed a lot of business to Bear Stearns. Do you regard that as ethical or unethical? The amount of corruption, sovereigns generally manage, in total manage $20 trillion. There's bribes, there's kickbacks all over the place. I will be shocked if in the next 2 or 3 years we do not find people from the Chinese sovereign wealth fund and other sovereign wealth funds swinging under bridges with ropes around their neck because of kickbacks. It happens all the time. So, or misrepresentations in deals. I think a very good friend of mine is chairman of Visa, godfather of our children. And I think when you write into these credit cards, very small print, interest rates pop up to 42% if you don't happen to pay on this such and such date. It turns out that date's a Sunday. I mean, people write this stuff. They do this stuff on purpose. What up? I don't get it. I don't get it. I wonder why they think nobody's watching. I don't get it. Development is impossible, Benedict writes, without upright men and women, without financiers and politicians whose consciences are finely tuned to the requirements of the common good. The common good. Restoring trust. Ensuring the market works so the United Nations Millennium Development Goals are even possible. Understanding and promoting that principle of subsidiarity. Fighting for intergenerational justice. Along with being a good father and a husband, a good sibling and a son, these are my temporal goals. And I'd sure love it if I could work on them with you all. Thank you.
Very nice. Good job.
It's also worth reading if you got time, Charity and Truth. It's a good read, actually.
For all of you, I thank Terry. He's done a great job and hope given us much to think about. Have a good night.
So I do